welcome to another episode of Higher Perspective Talks. I am joined with Mr. Stephen Denman today, and we are talking about the legendary Atlantis. Hello, Stephen. How are you doing?
Hi there, Zach. I'm doing well. How's everything with you?
Very good, my friend. Very good. So, tell us more about Atlantis. A very interesting continent that was once in our world and kind of disappeared mysteriously. So give us some insight into that. Tell us a little bit about where Atlantis actually was, first of all. Maybe just give people an idea of the placements of it.
Well, the Atlantean continent in historical terms was apparently located in the Atlantic Ocean. It was a vast landmass that was roughly the size of Western Europe, including the United Kingdom of Great Britain and the Irish Republic. It existed roughly, I suppose, or approximately midway where the mid-Atlantic ridge is in the Atlantic Ocean. Was kind of, that's where the Atlantean continent was rumoured to have been situated. It was geologically a landmass that had existed for millions upon millions of years before it was actually founded as a societal structure by these Nordic Aryans that became the Atlantean people. And so, yeah, that's pretty much the background to Atlantis. It was this huge kind of a continental landmass that once existed in the Atlantic Ocean, and in stages was basically destroyed through various means, which we can go into in this talk, and sunk into the depths of the Atlantic Ocean. And there are still pyramidal structures down there along the mid-Atlantic ridge today that are creating various anomalies and dimensional rifts in that part of the Atlantic Ocean.
You were talking, it was in between Europe and where America is situated now. So the ridge, that there is a ridge actually along there, right? Am I right?
That is correct. It's where there's a tectonic plate, a ridge-like structure that runs along in terms of a vertical linear movement structure in the mid-Atlantic Ocean region, and that is where the Atlantean continent sank into and crashed down into the watery depths, well, seemingly never to be seen again. But I think marine archaeologists probably know far more than they're letting on about what really happened. But that's all been deliberately censored and suppressed by, shall we say, the elites that were the ruling elites of the global system we have here on planet Earth.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about with museums and places now where we could possibly find some history of Atlantis.
In terms of museums, the only museum that I can think that would be the Smithsonian Institute. There is no actual evidence kept at all anywhere in any museums on planet Earth, certainly not for public access or public view. That would not be allowed. And even if there was, those archaeological remains, artifacts, and so forth would just simply be classed and classified as being connected to another civilization. It could be, so they would say it was connected to the Vedic Hindu civilization, or to the cultures of the Phoenician Aryans, or to the Irish Celts, the Scottish Celts. It won't be labelled up as anything connected to those Nordic Aryans who were the Atlantean people that inhabited the Atlantean continent. No, that's not going to be allowed by the ruling elites, because that immediately threatens the consensus reality they've created, which has edited the entire existence, the conceptual existence of Atlantis, out of the history books altogether. Because much of what went on in Atlantis connects directly to what is happening on planet Earth today, and they don't want human consciousness going back into, shall we say, deep ancestral memories and activating any level of true remembrance as to what went on. So that, in terms of any remnant cultures on this planet, there really isn't. All you have is certain racial characteristics amongst certain types of human beings, those that have blue eyes, blonde hair, pale white complexions, Northern Europeans, those of the Germanic tribal groups, those of the Scandinavian tribal groups, so people say from Germany, from Holland, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, the Irish Celts, the Scottish Celts. Out of all those groups, the Irish Celts have the strongest mitochondrial RNA, and therefore also connected with that DNA and genetic ancestral connections to the Atlantean continent. And in fact, the Irish Republic, the landmass of Ireland, is very, very important indeed to many things, which is also why there's been such a huge amount of censorship and suppression of Irish Celtic history, which also is connected to Irish Druidism, which is also distantly related to many of the ceremonial rituals, the different types of mysticism and sorcery and anciently founded spiritual sciences that had come out of the Atlantean continent that were to do with crystalline technologies usage and wireless electrical power transmission, and many other scientific endeavors, which again have been censored and suppressed by the ruling elites because they would really set human consciousness free from the financially driven slave system that we currently have on planet Earth today. Well, I think we need to remember that when we talk about those human beings, those Earth humans that can remember, deeply remember on a soul personality level, previous incarnations where they were Atlanteans, who had resided on the Atlantean continent. We have to look at the work of brilliant hypnotherapists like the greatly admired Dolores Cannon and Antonio Sangio and Sarah Breastman Cosme and also Bruce Goldberg, who have transcribed the information of thousands of clients who have given very detailed information concerning their previous incarnations on the Atlantean continent under the conditions that we would say in regressive hypnotherapy that have taken them back to that temporal marker in their previous incarnations on the Atlantean continent where they existed. They developed themselves spiritually as individuals and have a very clear racial, tribal, and ancestral memory of existing on the Atlantean continent. And again, if we're looking at the science behind regressive hypnotherapy, it's a science that is very well known. And then you take a look at the work of the soul realignment practitioner like Christina Sander and the very famous actress from Hollywood called Shirley MacLaine Beatty, who then became known as Shirley MacLaine, which is her stage name in her Hollywood movies. And these individuals have huge amounts of information that they've garnered from their own experiences using regressive hypnotherapy, all of which is sidelined, is not really given any real sense of serious academic consideration. And then you look at, for example, the sleeping prophet within America, the very famous and renowned Edgar Cayce, who did very detailed psychical readings concerning people's lifetimes and existences on the Atlantean continent from the 28th of April 1932 to the 29th of April 1932. And during that session, a huge amount of information came out on life and how people had existed, in the Atlantean continent. And it was fascinating information. So, science doesn't want to acknowledge any of this, just as science doesn't want to acknowledge astral projection, doesn't want to acknowledge really in many ways the conceptual idea of reincarnation and existing in this 3D holographic reality that we've come to call physical reality, and then maybe existing in different vibratory rates within the astral plane.
Can you give us an example of the sort of science that Atlantis had and the capabilities of what they were using?
Oh, well, the Atlanteans were super psychic and super telepathic. For example, I'll give you a few examples of their technology. They had very, very developed pineal glands, and they would wear a gold headband with, usually I think it was a specifically shaped amethyst purple quartz crystal right in front of where their pineal gland, the third eye, would be situated. And that would then amplify, if you like, and magnify their natural super psychic and super telepathic abilities. That's one example. So therefore, they didn't need, obviously, mobile phone technology or landline phone technology. Therefore, they didn't need transmitter towers to transmit and receive phone signals, etc. They didn't have the internet as that we have it today. They had a crystalline technology structure that was able to absorb, using their own super psychic and super telepathic abilities, amplified gold headbands they were wearing with these amethyst purple crystals at the center, to actually project their own cognitive thinking, their own ideas, their own thoughts, their own memories into these crystalline technology-based computer systems, and then they could project their own thoughts out as three-dimensional imagery, if you like. They could rotate them in different directions, and these were then stored on these ginormous circular crystalline discs in what was known as the Atlantean Hall of Records. So we know they had this technology. They also had a necklace type of electroacoustic technology where it would correspond to the vibration of their own names. And these Atlantean people, these Nordic Aryans, could basically speak and create a vibrational resonance, an electroacoustic resonance that would allow them to levitate. So they didn't need transportation such as road vehicles or aircraft or ships, although they did use naval vessels, and that was mainly for ceremonial reasons and just simply for the logistical reasons for transporting goods and aggregates and so forth for construction purposes and for trade globally on planet Earth. But for personalized travel, they could literally levitate up hillsides and mountainous regions without walking. They were able to levitate up to roof terraces on the tops of different residential buildings in urban environs.
Would that explain some of the stone circles around the world and rare places that kind of, you know, stone structures that just seem impossible to have been built man-made? Do you think that was connected to that levitation?
They were using electroacoustic devices, maybe on a more macro scale, industrial level, to levitate, you know, vast granite, stone. And it's known that they didn't use laser equipment to cut the stone. They were using concentrated and folded electroacoustic waves from some kind of sound resonators.
Kind of like like in June, the weapon they use with
yeah, in a more positive sense than
the positive sense.
Yeah. Fantastic film, directed by the great David Lynch, and in that movie where you see Carl McLachlan, who plays Paul Muad'Dib with that kind of electroacoustic resonator device. In a more positive aspect than in that movie, that's correct. That's what these Nordic Aryans, these Atlantean people, were using. So construction of buildings was effortless. It didn't require vast amounts of transportation with giant lorries and the kind of very, almost in many ways, very primitive and mechanistic petrochemical transportation kind of structures that we have on planet today. None of that was needed or required. I mean, they could just levitate the materials into place. They could use the electroacoustic resonators to literally cut the stone into shape and then stack it together. And they didn't even need to use mortar or any other aspect to attach the actual stone blocks together. But for their own personalized use, they could literally transport themselves by levitating up hillsides and mountainous regions just by literally speaking their name, and it would resonate an electromagnetic anti-gravity field around them and literally project them in the direction they wished to move. And they were able to then steer the direction they were moving. Wow. Then using the gold headband with the amethyst purple crystals at the center by obviously utilizing their own super psychic and super telepathic potency. So they were a totally different civilization than we have. The scientific endeavor and the sciences of spiritual development they had meant there was no need for money or financial transactions. There wasn't credit cards, debit cards. It was that's why it's known. There was the Atlantean Golden Period. That's why it's known there was the Atlantean Golden Period that lasted for literally thousands and thousands of years. It was an incredible time of absolute spiritual and mystical harmony. There was a complete infinite oneness and a realization of the divine love of the universal creator in every heart and every mind of all Atlantean citizens. But like all civilizations, they came to an end. And you've got to remember that when the Atlantean civilization was founded, and it was precisely founded around 5,813,672 years before the present by the Pleiadian Aryans. Now, you've got to remember, these were originally bioetheric existences. They were not physically tangible beings as we know today in terms of looking, solid state, physically looking, biologically manifested, Earth humans.
But she existed on the astral plane.
They existed between this 3D holographic reality that we now call physical reality and the astral plane, but they existed beyond linear space-time, so their vibratory rate wasn't synchronized into what we class as this standardized linear space-time that we're used to on planet Earth in this consensus reality.
Right.
We know that many of the Pleiadian-Aryans had experimented with creating shimmering animalistic outlines from within the astral plane that they had extracted through using crystalline technologies. And they were able to use those to descend and slow their vibratory rates right down on planet Earth and bring them into incarnation on the Atlantean continent. So we go back to that time of 5,813,672 years before present. We're looking at a totally differently conceptually founded societal structure, anything that we could recognize today. It's so bizarre that it almost sounds fantastic.
And it also connects with everything. The inversion is completely inverted.
The satanic reversalism that's going on today, the Luciferian ritualism that is played out as, standardized 3D holographic reality, which is now classes a physical reality that we have to all accept is the only thing that's tangible. We have to also remember that the actual more solidified aspects and the electromagnetic condensement of the Atlantean civilization that these bioetheric Pleiadian Aryans had brought into being, right? So who had taken these animalistic outlines from the astral plane as a vibrational vehicle, if you like, to actually incarnate themselves into the slower vibrations and the geomagnetic ley lines and resonances and the morphogenic field around the planet Earth on the Atlantean continent. Now that didn't start until around 254,798 years before present, and it's from that Pacific temporal marker in anciently founded history when the more condensed vibrational aspects of the Atlantean civilization began. So we say more tangible and visibly present. Right. Nordic Aryans, these Pleiadian Aryans started to look more visible, had detailed contours, and you would say, there was more opacity, especially in direct sunlight, where they weren't sort of partially translucent, if that makes any sense.
Right. So what did they actually become more physical the more they interacted? It's very intriguing that. So do you think they come from like an astral form into a physical, or do you think they were born in a physical but they were able to cross over into the astral form as well, into the two worlds?
Well, the Pleiadian Aryans that founded the Atlantean civilization and then made it more tangible on a vibrational level from around 254,798 years before present, from that Pacific time, were already themselves an advanced, obviously, interstellar societal structure from the planet known as Atlan and the planet known as Area, which orbit the star Taygeta, which is in the Pleiades stellar cluster, which is in the Taurus constellation. So they had brought their entire belief structure to planet Earth, and they wanted to slow their vibratory rates down and actually have greater interaction with the much slower vibratory rates in the geomagnetic ley lines and the morphogenic fields around planet Earth. They wanted greater sensorial interaction, if you like, with the physical reality around them. And they needed to do that by creating constant vibratory interlinks from the astral plane and drawing down many of the ecosystem species, if you like, that we see today on planet Earth did not originate from this planet at all. They were brought here either from the Pleiades stellar cluster or actually condensed down from various resonant environments in the astral plane, and then they were interlinked to planet Earth. So again, this is completely at odds with what we're told in mainstream science, Western science, Masonic science, if you like, and academia. That would say that's all complete rubbish. That's all disinformation. That makes no sense. But the truth is, when you analyse all their scientific endeavours, especially
exactly the same, there's loads of holes in it the other
absolutely.
way.
I mean, you take a look at the complete lie and deception. That's basically the situation. Is they wanted greater interaction with the ecosystems on planet Earth. They wanted to understand a greater knowledge of human sexuality by having greater sensorial and pleasure-based interaction, but not in a perverse or carnal way. It was done all through spiritual and esoteric elegance, and using various types of supernal rituals and ceremonies. So, and there wasn't, anything like fornication or adultery going on. That did start to happen in the last aeons of Atlantis as the society disintegrated, which is a huge subject to go into. But yeah, so the Atlantean civilization started as an incredible endeavor, and it then progressively became more and more vibrationally condensed as the aeons went by. Simple as that.
Interesting. So, Steve, from what you're saying about Atlantis, it seems like the beings were much more advanced than we are now. What was it that intercepted that race of beings? What is it that changed their vibration to start going down a materialistic route?
Well, I think one of the things that needs to be remembered that around 85,631 years before present, there was a series of massive sea quakes in and around the mid-Atlantic ridge underneath where the Atlantean continent was based. Much of the Atlantean continent was built or existed on coral reefs, so it was not geologically very stable around the coastal regions. We know that around that time of 85,631 years before present, there have been many experiments done by various scientific individuals, shall we say the Atlantean priests who regarded themselves as the spiritual scientists, who've been experimenting with different types of electromagnetic and, shall we say, telluric or earth energetic based power transmission systems to do with what's called the Great Firestone. Now, the Great Firestone was a huge ruby, reddish coloured or reddish orange coloured quartz crystal at the very centre of the Atlantean continent that was used for all the electromagnetic and therefore electrical distribution and connected to anti-gravity vehicle technologies, etc., the crystalline technologies they had. So that then basically malfunctioned. The reason for that is these Atlantean priests had become very, shall we say, egocentric. They were identifying increasingly with their own power, their own knowledge base, their own scientific endeavors, and they were tinkering around with things that were very dangerous in terms of energetic overloads that then caused massive rupturing in the tectonic plates in the mid-Atlantic ridge underneath the Atlantean continent once that event occurred. And in and around that time, therefore, the Atlantean mainland was completely destroyed and was inundated by the salt waters of the Atlantic Ocean and sank.
You know how it was destroyed, or possibly, or possibilities of how it was destroyed?
Well, because of the malfunction of the Great Firestone, because they had miscalculated what they were doing with the actual telluric, and that's the earth energetic-based power transmissions. However, if you look at what was going on a psychological and mental level with these Atlantean priests, the spiritual scientists, they were being increasingly influenced because of their egocentric and very, shall we say, rejected behavior of, shall we say, divine consciousness by lower astral entities. We call these are plasmic entities. Some people call them demonic entities, who were controlled by a much greater demonic force that was known as Belial, which was an arch demon, if you like, in the lower astral, in the infernal regions, that wanted to gain complete control over the cognitive thinking, the psychological outlooks, and therefore the social behavior of the Atlantean people, these Nordic Aryans. And the best best option that was available was to immediately focus in on those who are very egocentric, who had become increasingly egocentric and to some extent egocentonic, who were these Atlantean priests who believed that they were the spiritual scientists, the inheritors of this incredible knowledge. We're going back, thousands and thousands of years to the founding of the Atlantean civilization, who then, in some ways, we could say probably allowed their own incompetency to play out, but really under the surface, it was deliberately done. There was a deliberate, slow motion, destructive intention in causing that electromagnetic rupturing of the Atlantean continent that they knew would cause geological devastation, which it did, which then caused the Atlantean mainland to become inundated with the salt waters of the Atlantic Ocean around 85,631 years before present, and it sank. However, there were three main Atlantean islands that did remain for many aeons after that, and they were then finally destroyed from around 10,754 years before present to 10,753 years before present, which finally brought to an end the entire legacy of the Atlantean civilization, the Atlantean continent. Obviously, the Atlantean mainland had gone, and the three remaining Atlantean islands had gone, and then it became nothing but a fable, a myth, an illusion. And those Atlantean colonies that had survived and left before the Atlantean islands being destroyed, they went to places like mainland Europe. They went to places, for example, like the Irish Republic, especially Southern Ireland, and parts of the United Kingdom of Great Britain, and also parts of Central America and South America, especially places like Brazil and places like Paraguay and Uruguay and Argentina. We know that, for example, the Tibetan Autonomous Province, where the Tian Shan Mountains are, and the Kunlun Mountains around the Tibetan Autonomous Province were also remote sanctuaries where Atlantean colonies were founded covertly, and much of the very advanced crystalline technologies were then transported there. This is, long before the three Atlantean islands were destroyed, around 10,754 years before present to 10,753 years before present. So they became, if you like, the Atlantean civilization, in a sense, created the very first inaccessible secret societies, because the remnants of the spiritual sciences, the occult technology that had been born out of these crystalline technological endeavors, the devices, the gadgets, all the different knowledge they had, everything that was based in the Atlantean Hall of Records, all of that information was then placed into the hands of the surviving Nordic Aryans, these Atlantean people, the Atlantean colonists, who then took all that knowledge with them. Whilst you had, millions upon millions of Earth humans milling around, living their everyday tribal existences in different geographic locations on planet Earth. So it was a very, very stressful time on planet Earth.
And very intense. The transformation, it would have been such a knock down, from what they had. I find it fascinating that these, if this was part of our soul contract to actually not remember this stuff and to forget it, to then learn it again. And that makes it interesting. It's like it had to be reset because it had reached a destructive point. You see, like you were saying about the Atlantis priests and the way they developed into this kind of egocentric way and power ready.
And you've got to remember there was equality between the sexes in Atlantis. There's the Atlantean priesthood was predominantly controlled by priestesses. It was the divine feminine principle.
Wow. Okay.
The Atlantean matriarchy was very powerful and held complete control over the different Atlantean healing temples, the different Atlantean divination temples that were used to genetically purify and restore people's health, medical health. But we know that all of this was completely destroyed. And again, you look at what was happening in the lower astral, the infernal regions, with these plasmic entities that some can call demonic entities under this arch demon or this demonic overlord called Belial. And we can see very clearly how that kind of intrapsychic infiltration of Atlantean culture and the Atlantean civilization was taking place over a period of many, many aeons.
Yeah.
And the more they descended into more and more slowed vibratory and condensed existences, because of that need to be experiential, sensorial, more interactive with this 3D holographic reality that we now call physical reality, and less connected to the much faster vibratory rates in the higher astral plane, they immediately subjugated themselves to more and more subversive intrapsychic control and manipulation, especially amongst the Atlantean priesthood. And obviously, it wasn't just these Atlantean priests who were spiritual scientists, but this affected the Atlantean matriarchy. It affected the Atlantean priesthood in general, which was mainly controlled by these very, very well-respected and revered ladies who were the Atlantean priestesses.
Just kind of bringing it to the present day, do you think that now, because we have such a male-dominated society, do you think that was part of the reason that crossover, it's almost, we don't know what that is, but that outside energy, the outside force of this planet and universe and what we're living in, almost decided that we needed that change. We needed the male dominance to kind of come over. I mean, what do you think of that?
Well, we know that the plasmic entities that we can call these demonic entities in the lower astral, the infernal regions, tend to air more, shall we say, they tend to focus more on, shall we say, male energetics or masculine identity than the female. And it's because on a super psychic and super telepathic level, we know that the plasmic entities, demonic entities, and this demonic overlord called Belial very clearly sense the incredible power and potency of the divine feminine principle, the Atlantean matriarchy, and what it could achieve. And that had to be shut down. Now, on a much deeper, shall we say, esoteric, transdimensional and incarnation level, yes, there's a giant learning curve, literally over thousands and thousands of years here in terms of soul personality, experientiality in this 3D holographic reality we can call physical reality. And that was meant, on one level, was meant to happen.
Yeah.
But the catastrophic trauma, the collectivized trauma that took place for the Nordic Aryans, the Atlantean people, whether they were, male or female, and the complete destruction in many ways of the divine feminine principle and the Atlantean matriarchy that had held control and was revered, created a huge schism in Atlantean culture, which then further, through divide and rule, helped to disintegrate the original spiritual teachings, the spiritual precepts, the spiritual tenets of that incredible social structure, and sent it literally further and further descending into slower and slower vibratory rates until there really wasn't anything special or unique about the Atlantean civilization. They become, in many ways, very animalistic, very egocentric. Those that were still very spiritual had become an ever-increasing minority that had fled before the destruction of those three Atlantean islands around 10,754 years before present to 10,753 years before present, and knew what was coming on a very deeply psychical level. They knew, they had many premonitions. We can call that a form of ESP. It was a form of precognitive awareness of what was going to happen to the Atlantean civilization. And they knew they couldn't save their brothers and sisters, that what was going to happen was going to be horrific, traumatic. There was going to be sea quakes, earthquakes, massive volcanic activity once, the entire remnants of those Atlantean islands disappeared. They knew that much of what they were would have to be passed on to various Earth humans that had formed tribal groupings in different geographic locations, but who they were and the definition of who those Northern were, those Atlantean people, would become nothing but fables and mythical ideas and concepts, but it would just be classed as, aspects in Greek mythology. We have to remember that the genetically, racially and tribally, the Irish people, the Irish Celts, in their purest originated form actually represent the finest example of Atlantean colonies.
Wow.
You can remember we had the glacial period that occurred literally from around 10,754 years before present to 10,753 years before present, which had occurred because once the three Atlantean islands collapsed into the Atlantic Ocean on the mid-Atlantic ridge, it created an elliptical wobble because of the huge amount of sea quake, earthquake, and volcanic activity. So planet Earth started wobbling on its axes, which then helped to bring in a huge, a very large-scale ice age and glacial period in the northern hemisphere. But Southern Ireland geographically was completely glacial free. There was no glacial sheeting. There wasn't really any sleet.
Wow.
So they were able to grow cereal crops, fruits, and vegetables and thrive very well.
Interesting. Wow.
Yeah, absolutely true.
Amazing.
But the whole of Western Europe, Eastern Europe, most of South America, and the United Kingdom of Great Britain was completely covered in glacial sheeting under huge amounts of snow and ice.
How did they know that the island was going to be like ice free? Did they maneuver, just go through and discover that, or did they actually go to Ireland knowing? Do you think that they were just sailing around and they found a piece of land? You mean?
Well, even though salt water freezes, I mean, fresh water will freeze at at 0 degrees Celsius. It's much lower for salt water. There were still waterways or tributaries that were navigatable, or navigational. Sorry, edit that out. So they could navigate through certain waterways still that existed in the Atlantic Ocean, and then they made their way and would have obviously, sighted far away. They had telescopes and binoculars in Atlantis that were far more advanced. The level of optical technologies they had then were far more advanced than we've got today. And they would have cited Southern Ireland as being completely ice-free and knew that they could go there. There's a lot of connections in Southern Ireland, around County Meath, the Boyne Valley, the River Boyne area, in that part of the Irish Republic, where the real history is not being taught, and it's very deep and very profound, those connections, and it all does go back into the great and distant past to when the Atlantean civilization existed.
Well, just on that point, what I find really intriguing is the way around the world there's certain countries that are attacked, and I believe there's a reason that these countries over and over again are kind of some way bullied almost by other nations. And from what you're saying is that the old Atlantean human, if you like, the old Atlantean, they were so advanced and their DNA was so evolved compared to where we are now, that it's almost like that DNA through trauma and this war that these countries and oppression these countries are put under constantly to this day. Ireland's a good example. It's transforming their DNA, because so there must be reminiscence of their DNA from Atlantis still there, and little sparks of it, you see, that light up. So it's like if they now condition the people and put them into a box and that can almost like that will transform the DNA. Behavioral patterns on the human will eventually transform the DNA within. But tell us, what do you think about that? What do you think about that? There's actually this kind of sense of the bullying.
That's true. It's been relentless, and the Irish people have had that specifically done to them. Okay, you could say on a collective soul personality level, the Irish Celtic tribes on a vibrational level attracted that as a much deeper form of spiritual and esoteric learning for themselves in terms of their own experientiality.
And that's something, just say, that's something that's very interesting, is because this is part of our development. For us to forget, for us to, get removed is actually for us to remember. And I think that's a really good point where you're, where you're talking. It's not like we've lost this information, we've just forgotten it and we have to reintegrate it. And it's maybe because the ego was overtaking the spiritual self, and that was vital for our development. We can't have the ego going above the spiritual self. Right. We are spiritual beings. That's what we have to remember.
I will say this: if the millions of Irish people, whether they're in the Irish Republic or Northern Ireland, were to kind of go and seek out regressive hypnotherapy, I think the results would be very, very interesting. What they would find if they were to then go back and use temporal markers going back before 10,754 years before present to perhaps 10,753 years before present, and what would come out to do with those Atlantean islands and also what was going on in Southern Ireland at that time. It's very, very interesting. And again, scientific endeavor and academia that are not interested in that because immediately it conflicts with everything to do with anthropology. It conflicts with the aspects of Masonic Darwinism, which is a complete and utter fraud. It's complete deception. We've discussed that before, and then you take a look at, aspects to do with tribal cultures and so forth. They don't want to admit that, human beings that have deep racial and genetic connections to these Nordic Aryans, the Atlantean people, say from Ireland, actually had a culture before them, a cultural structure they descended from that was so spiritually profound and advanced, because that again is in direct opposition to what the ruling elites want, which is everything they do is turned around. It's all completely inverted and distorted. On every aspect, to do with everything from, electrical power distribution on this planet, the use of mechanistic petrochemical road vehicles. Yeah. I mean, the technology we should have now should be completely solar photovoltaic electric vehicles. They could run both on an aerological combustion system or compression system, anti-gravity based, completely pollution free. And we still have road vehicles with rubber tires and petrol and diesel. It's so primitive.
It's crazy, yeah.
Yeah, and you take a look at the use of using electrical wiring for electrical distribution when you've already got, like the individual, one of the greatest men who's ever lived on Earth, the genius himself from Serbia in Eastern Europe, Nikola Tesla.
Tesla, yeah.
He invented wireless electrical distribution systems on this planet, the patents of which have all been confiscated, censored and suppressed. And he didn't want to charge, human beings a penny because he said, well, it's all based on geomagnetic and telluric, basically currents in terms of frequency, vibration and energy, which is infinite and generated from planet Earth itself. But of course, they couldn't make money as a control mechanism over Earth humans unless they brought in this reverse system. That's
in a square centimeter of air, there is enough energy to power the world. This is apparently, with free energy systems, how they work. God knows how that works.
When you say it like that, it makes how we view human consciousness look completely ludicrous, because how we got this system in place, and yet we've all gone along with this to then somehow learn to reverse back and restore the spiritual sciences of what we're going to be heading back towards, and I'd say after 2030.
Yeah.
If we then take one other aspect to this is, all the so-called creatures from Irish folklore, which really goes back to Atlantean folklore and also next to Native American folklore. And you take, just example, things like elves and pixies and dwarves and fairies. These different supernatural life forms or supernatural beings, all of them actually did exist because they exist in the astral plane in a much faster vibratory rate. Once the Nordic Aryans, these Atlantean people, started to descend further and further, they were not able to directly interact on a psychical level, with the elves, with the pixies, with the dwarves, and with the fairies, and all the other types of supernatural beings, but they still exist.
Yeah.
So it was a very magical, mystical, expansive time in terms of human consciousness. Atlantean consciousness, if you like, was just so incredible, and the lives they lived, from the dreams they had to being able to levitate using electroacoustic resonators up mountainous regions and hillsides, to wearing gold headbands with amethyst purple crystals that could amplify and magnify their incredibly profound super psychic and super telepathic potency, are aspects of any societal structure that we really need to be heading back to. But in the current, shall we say, geopolitical climate of what's going on planet Earth at the moment, we won't be going into any of that. it's
No, but I think we will reach that point, Steve, and I think
oh,
that's
it's like,
we'll get back to that stage. This is just being forgotten, so it's not disappeared, it's not being removed,
that's right.
and this is where we're coming to, and it's like what we're doing now is bringing this back into resonance. Is making people remember, question things about it. So we have to, and it will come back to us. I think an absolutely amazing talk. And is there anything else you want to add? And coming up to the end now.
Yeah, I think that with the Atlantean civilization, people need to know that they are a huge learning curve. And I would suggest if people are more interested in the subject of Atlantis itself, and they feel they have some deep connection with it, but they're not sure how that is really kind of apparent in their lives, but they sense it in their minds, I would suggest seeking out a qualified clinical hypnotherapist and looking to have at least one or more sessions of regressive hypnotherapy. I mean, when you look back to people like the incredible Dolores Cannon and her work, she was an amazing lady, and she developed voluminous amounts of information from transcripting the information she'd received from her clients in regressive hypnotherapy sessions, much of it to do with Atlantis, to do with extraterrestrial biological entities, to do with the astral plane. So we know it's real, but it's kind of become very self-censored and self-suppressed within the mitochondrial RNA, and therefore within the DNA and the genetics of millions and millions of Earth humans that did have lifetimes, perhaps many incarnations in the Atlantean continent. And it was a very traumatic time. The destruction of Atlantis in both
horrific.
in both historical temporal markers in both those times was so stressful, and the geological upheaval, all the sea quakes and the earthquakes, the volcanic activity, and the destruction and the loss of so much of their own scientific advancements and endeavors, and everything that they've known as people, we can't really envisage how traumatic and stressful that time must have been. It was horrendous. So the trauma is almost being repressed to try and forget it. So this time of great forgetting will become a time of great remembering. And I think after 2030, we're going to reach an electromagnetic and vibrational turning point with Earth humans. The human beings on planet Earth are going to increasingly want to remember and start to remember who they really are and the true potential of human consciousness, and how that connects back to the time of the Atlantean civilization, all those Nordic Aryans, those Atlantean citizens that once existed on the Atlantean continent. And that's really all I've got to say on this matter, really. Yeah, absolutely.
That's amazing, and I think a good what you say in there, Steve. I think we are going to reach that point. I do feel that we forget things. It's like our childhood happens and we forget our childhood. Then we get older and we remember it, and then we start solving the problems and getting through the issues. So this is kind of like our lifetimes on Earth, if you like. We're remembering slowly. Faster day by day, but we're remembering. So this is where we're at, and I think it's exciting. I think we're should be all very excited about where we're heading with this knowledge and information that's coming out. So brilliant, Stephen. Thank you for that talk. It was really good, really fulfilling, excellent information there. And it's bye from me, Zach.
And it's bye from me, Stephen.